The children who remember tomorrow. It began with small, unsettling details. Children, ordinary in every way, started describing events that hadn't happened yet. Not vague predictions, but precise moments. A crash at a specific bridge, a fire in a hospital wing, a stranger arriving at an exact time. Adults dismissed it as imagination, until everything unfolded exactly as the children had said. Panic spread quietly. The pattern was undeniable. Among those watching was a man who refused to believe until he heard a prediction that wasn't public, something only he should have known. Drawn by fear more than curiosity, he sought out one of the children. The child was waiting. It looked at him, calm and certain, and asked, "Why did you reset it?" The question struck something buried deep in his memory, an image he had never shared, a place that didn't make sense, a console, a single button labeled "ROLLBACK." Then the child handed him a drawing. In it, he stood before that button, but this time he wasn't pressing it, and that's when he realized the children weren't predicting the future. They were remembering a different one. The first signs. It didn't begin with panic. It began with something so small, so easily dismissed, that no one thought to question it. A child raised their hand in class. Not to answer a question, but to say something strange. "The bus is going to crash tomorrow," the boy said, his voice calm, almost bored. "Near the old bridge. It'll happen in the morning." The teacher paused, waiting for the punchline that never came. A few students laughed. Someone whispered that he'd been watching too many movies. The teacher smiled gently and told him to focus on his drawing, and that should have been the end of it. But the next morning, the bus crashed, exactly where he said it would. Exactly when. It wasn't a major accident. No one died, just a mechanical failure, a loss of control, a collision against the guardrail. The kind of thing that appears briefly on the news and disappears just as quickly, except for one detail. The location, the old bridge. The boy had never been there. At first, it was treated as coincidence, a lucky guess, an eerie one, sure, but still just a guess. Until it happened again. Another child, different school, different city. "There's going to be a fire," she told her mother while eating breakfast. "At the hospital. Not big at first, but it spreads." Her mother frowned, distracted, assuming it was a nightmare bleeding into the morning. She told her daughter not to say things like that. That night, a fire broke out in a hospital storage room. Small, at first, then it spread. Investigators would later determine it was caused by faulty wiring. A technical failure. Nothing unusual, nothing supernatural, but the girl had described it hours before it happened. Not just the fire, but how it would begin. That was when the pattern started to form. Reports surfaced quietly at first. A teacher mentioning an odd statement, a parent recalling something their child had said days earlier, a security guard who remembered a kid pointing at a staircase and saying, "Someone's gonna fall there." And then someone did. Each case on its own could be explained away. Children say strange things all the time. They imagine, exaggerate, repeat things they've overheard. But this was different. These weren't vague predictions. They were specific, consistent, accurate. And most unsettling of all, the children never seemed surprised when they came true. There was no excitement, no fear, no sense of "I told you so." Just recognition, as if they weren't guessing, as if they weren't predicting anything at all, as if they were remembering something that had already happened. Adults began to notice the tone, the way the children spoke, calm, certain, detached, like witnesses recalling events from a place no one else could see. And then came the moment that made everything harder to ignore. A teacher, unsettled by what she'd heard, decided to ask one of the children a simple question. "How do you know these things?" The child looked at her, confused. Not by the question, but by the fact that she had to ask. Then he gave an answer that would linger far longer than anyone expected. "I don't know them," he said quietly. "I remember them." Too many coincidences. At first, the incidents were isolated, scattered, easy to ignore. A comment here, a strange prediction there, each one explainable on its own. Coincidence, imagination, coincidence again. But patterns have a way of forming when no one is looking, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. It started with conversations between adults, quiet ones, a teacher mentioning something unusual in the staff room, a parent bringing up a strange remark during a phone call, a doctor recalling a child who had calmly described an emergency hours before it arrived. At first, they laughed it off. Then they started comparing details, and the laughter stopped because the stories were no longer just similar. They were aligning, different children, different places, no connection between them. Yet they all spoke the same way, calm, certain, precise. "A man is going to fall down those stairs," one child said, pointing casually in a shopping mall. Security footage later showed exactly that. The timing matched, the location matched, even the way it happened matched. Another child refused to enter a building one afternoon. "There's something wrong with the lights," she said. "They're going to go out, and people will panic." Minutes later, a localized power failure plunged the building into darkness. Emergency lights flickered. People rushed toward exits. Panic, just like she said. It was no longer possible to dismiss these moments as chance. There were too many, too precise, too consistent. Someone began documenting them. At first, it was informal, a shared file, a collection of notes passed between concerned individuals. Teachers, parents, local authorities, anyone who had witnessed something unusual. Dates, locations, statements, outcomes. The list grew faster than expected. And then someone noticed something even more disturbing: the time gap. Most predictions weren't far into the future. Hours, sometimes a day, rarely more. It was as if the children weren't seeing ahead, but recalling something recent, something that had just happened, in another version of events. That theory, of course, sounded absurd until the recording surfaced. A parent, unsettled by their child's behavior, had started filming their conversations. In one clip, a young boy sat at the kitchen table, swinging his legs idly. "You shouldn't drive tonight," he said without looking up. His father laughed. "Why not?" "You'll miss the turn," the boy replied, "and then the car behind you won't stop." There was no fear in his voice, no hesitation, just a statement. The father didn't listen. Later that night, his car was hit from behind after he missed a turn. Minor injuries, nothing fatal. But the details matched, exactly. The video spread quietly at first, shared between small circles. Then it reached people who took it more seriously, people who didn't believe in coincidence. And suddenly, the narrative began to shift. This wasn't imagination. It wasn't mass hysteria. It wasn't even prediction. It was something else, something far more unsettling. Because if these children weren't guessing, then they weren't seeing the future. They were remembering it. And if they were remembering events that hadn't happened yet, then those events must have existed somewhere. At some point, in some version of reality that no longer remained. That idea should have been impossible. But the evidence kept growing, and with every new case, one question became harder to ignore. If the future had already happened once, then what changed it? And more importantly, who did? Because buried deep within the growing list of recorded statements was something new, something different. A child who didn't describe an event, but a person. "You weren't supposed to be there this time," the child said to no one in particular. Then, after a pause, "You usually fix it." For the first time, the coincidences didn't just point to events. They pointed to someone who wasn't supposed to exist in this version of the future. Someone who had changed things before. Someone who, somehow, had done this more than once. The protagonist. He wasn't supposed to matter. That's what he told himself every time the stories surfaced, every time another clip circulated, another report appeared, another quiet conversation hinted at something impossible. He kept his distance, treating it all like noise. Strange, yes, unsettling, maybe, but not his problem, until it was. He lived a quiet life, the kind built carefully around routine. Wake up at the same time, take the same route to work, avoid unnecessary conversations, keep things predictable, stable, controlled, because control mattered to him more than most. Not for any reason he could clearly explain, just a feeling, a need, like something inside him resisted chaos on a fundamental level. So when the first reports about the children appeared, he dismissed them without much thought. Viral stories, exaggerations, people seeing patterns where none existed. But something about them lingered. Not the events themselves, the tone, the way the children spoke, calm, certain, familiar. He couldn't explain why that detail unsettled him more than anything else. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was late evening. He was alone, the television playing in the background more for noise than attention. A new segment cut in, brief, almost forgettable. Authorities have confirmed a minor electrical failure will occur tonight in the Eastern District. Preventative measures are already being taken. He froze. The phrasing was wrong. Not might occur, not has occurred, will occur. The anchor moved on quickly, correcting themselves, brushing past it like a simple mistake. But the damage was done because he already knew, not in a vague, intuitive way, not like a guess. He knew exactly where it would happen, exactly when, and exactly how it would unfold. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept in, slow and suffocating. A flicker of memory, a street corner under dim lights, a sudden outage, people stopping, looking up, confused, then darkness. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor louder than it should have been. His heart was racing, but not from fear, from recognition. He grabbed his phone, searching for any official report, any mention of the incident. Nothing detailed, nothing specific, and yet he could see it, clear as something that had already happened. Without thinking, he left his apartment. The night air was colder than expected, or maybe it just felt that way. He moved quickly, following a route he didn't consciously choose. Turn after turn, street after street, guided by something he didn't want to acknowledge. When he arrived, it was exactly where he knew it would be. A quiet intersection, a row of flickering streetlights. For a moment, nothing happened. Silence, stillness, and then the lights went out, all at once. A sharp, sudden blackout. People nearby paused, murmuring, pulling out their phones. Confusion spread, subtle at first, then growing. Exactly as he remembered. He stepped back, his breathing uneven now. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a guess. This was memory. But it couldn't be. He had never been here before. Had he? The thought lingered longer than it should have, because deep down something didn't feel new. It felt repeated, as if he wasn't witnessing this moment for the first time, but for the first time without interference. That was a thought that truly unsettled him. Without interference. The words formed in his mind without invitation, and with them came something else. An image, faint, fragmented, but unmistakable. A room that didn't belong anywhere. Cold, metallic, silent. At the center of it, a console. And on that console, a single button. He staggered slightly, gripping the edge of a nearby wall as the image sharpened just enough to make his pulse spike. He couldn't see the whole thing, but he didn't need to, because he already knew what it said. Roll back. The word echoed in his mind like something remembered rather than imagined. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push it away, trying to dismiss it, but it didn't feel like imagination. It felt like something he had forgotten, something important, something he wasn't supposed to remember. When he opened his eyes again, the street was still dark. People were still reacting, still adjusting, still living through the moment as if it were happening for the first time. But for him, it wasn't. And that was the moment he understood something he couldn't ignore anymore. The children weren't the only ones who remembered. He did too. He just hadn't realized it yet. The encounter. He didn't plan to find one of them. Not really. He told himself he was just walking, just following a feeling he couldn't quite explain. The same feeling that had led him to the blackout. The same quiet pull that seemed to guide him without asking permission. But deep down he knew. He wasn't looking for answers anymore. He was looking for confirmation. The playground was nearly empty when he arrived. Dusk had already settled in, draining the color from everything. The swings creaked softly in the wind, moving just enough to feel intentional. A rusted slide reflected the last traces of fading light. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt staged, like a place waiting for something to happen, or something that already had. He slowed his steps as he approached, and then he saw the child, sitting alone on a swing, not moving, just watching, waiting. There was nothing outwardly unusual about them. No visible difference from any other child. No sign that this one was any different from the others he had heard about, but the stillness was wrong. Children didn't sit like that, not without fidgeting, not without distraction. This one didn't even blink as he approached. Their eyes locked onto him immediately, as if they had been expecting him. He stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind shifted slightly, brushing through the empty playground, carrying with it a low, hollow sound that made the silence feel heavier than it should have been. He opened his mouth, unsure of what he was about to say. But before he could speak, the child tilted their head, just slightly. And then, in a voice that was soft but unnervingly certain, they asked, "Why did you reset it?" The words hit him harder than they should have, not because of what they meant, but because of how they felt. Familiar. Too familiar. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. A sudden tension, a sharp intake of breath. His heart began to race, not from fear alone, but from recognition. "How do you?" he started, but the words faltered because he didn't know what he was asking. "How do you know that? How do you know me? How do you know something I don't even understand?" The child didn't answer immediately. They just watched him, studying him, not with curiosity, but with something closer to disappointment, as if he wasn't reacting the way they expected him to. "You always do," the child said quietly. The word always echoed in his mind. Always. As if this wasn't the first time, as if it had happened before, more than once. "That doesn't make any sense," he said, his voice unsteady now. "I've never," he stopped, because the sentence didn't feel true, not completely. The image returned without warning. The room, silent, unfamiliar, and yet not unfamiliar at all. The console stood at the center, exactly as he had seen it before, smooth, metallic, unmarked except for one thing, the button. Rollback. His head throbbed as the memory pushed further than before, trying to surface. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the words sounded weaker now, less certain. The child's gaze didn't shift. "You don't remember this one," they said. "This one. Not you don't remember. You don't remember this one." As if there were others. Versions. Attempts. Failures. The implication settled into his chest like something heavy and immovable. "What do you mean, this one?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The child didn't respond directly. Instead, they slowly reached into a small bag resting at their feet. The movement was calm, deliberate, unhurried. He felt his pulse quicken with every second. Without a word, the child pulled out a piece of paper, folded once, worn at the edges, and held it out to him. For a moment, he hesitated. Something in him didn't want to take it, didn't want to see it, because part of him already knew whatever was on that paper, he wouldn't be able to ignore it. But his hand moved anyway, almost involuntarily. He took the drawing and unfolded it. At first glance, it looked like any other child's sketch. Rough lines, imperfect shapes, a lack of detail that made everything slightly distorted. But then the image settled, and his breath caught in his throat. It was him. There was no mistaking it. Not because of accuracy, but because of placement, position, context. He was standing in a room, the one from his memory, the one he couldn't explain. The console stood in front of him, and there it was, the button, rollback, drawn in thick, uneven letters, glowing, important, inevitable. But something was wrong, or rather, something was different. His drawn figure stood perfectly still, hand hovering just above the button, not pressing it, not moving, just stopping, choosing. For the first time, the image didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a possibility, a version of something that hadn't happened yet, or hadn't happened this way. His grip on the paper tightened slightly. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely steady. The child stood up from the swing. The chains creaked softly as the seat swayed behind them. For the first time, they looked almost human again. Almost. But their eyes remained unchanged, calm, certain, knowing. They stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the presence of them, not just physically, but something deeper, something heavier. And then they said the one thing he wasn't ready to hear. "This is the one where you don't fix it." Silence followed, thick, unavoidable. His mind struggled to process the words. Don't fix it, as if everything that had happened before, all the events, all the coincidences, all the disasters that never fully escalated, had been stopped, corrected, erased by him. He looked back down at the drawing, at his own unmoving hand, and for the first time, he understood what truly terrified him. Not the children, not their knowledge, not even the idea of a reset, but the possibility that this time he wouldn't press the button, and whatever came next would finally be allowed to happen. the secret he never shared. He had never told anyone, not because he had decided to keep it a secret, but because until now it had never felt real enough to explain. It had always existed in fragments, disconnected flashes, moments that didn't belong to any clear memory, appearing only in the quiet spaces between thoughts, just before sleep, or in the brief silence after waking. He had spent years dismissing them as dreams, residual images, the brain misfiring, stitching together nonsense from pieces of reality. But now they felt different. Now they felt remembered. The child's question still echoed in his mind. Why did you reset it? Not what is it? Not what did you see? Why did you reset it? As if the act itself was unquestionable, as if the only mystery was his reason. He sat alone in his apartment, the lights off, the city humming faintly outside. The darkness felt appropriate, safer somehow. Like the less he saw of the world, the easier it was to focus on what was happening inside his head. He closed his eyes, and this time, he didn't try to push the images away. He let them come. At first, it was the same as before. The room, cold, metallic, endless in a way that didn't make sense, as if the walls existed only where they needed to and nowhere else. Then the console, centered, waiting. The surface was smooth, untouched by time or use. No dust, no wear. Just a single purpose built into its design. And the button, ROLLBACK. The word didn't feel like a label. It felt like a command, or maybe a responsibility. His breathing slowed as the memory sharpened. This time, it didn't stop at the image. This time, it continued. He saw himself, not from within, but from outside, like watching a recording, standing in front of the console, exactly as the drawing had shown, but different. In this version, his hand was already moving, reaching. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a quiet, practiced motion, like something he had done before, many times. The realization struck him with a force that made his chest tighten. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even close. The memory shifted, expanded. Fragments began connecting, forming something larger, something coherent. He saw flashes, a city in chaos, sirens echoing endlessly, smoke rising into a sky that looked wrong, as if the color itself had been altered. A hospital corridor filled with panic, people running, lights flickering, alarms blaring without rhythm. A car accident, worse than the one he had witnessed, twisted metal, silence where there should have been sound. Each image felt familiar, not because he had seen them, but because he had stopped them, or tried to. The pattern became clearer with every passing second. The children's predictions, they weren't random, they were remnants, echoes of events that had happened in a version of reality that no longer existed, a version he had erased. His hands trembled slightly as the truth began to take shape. He wasn't just remembering, he was remembering after the fact, after the reset, after the rollback. That was why everything felt fragmented, because the timeline itself had been broken, rewritten, again and again and again. He opened his eyes abruptly, pulling himself out of the memory before it could go deeper. But it didn't matter. He had seen enough. He stood up slowly, pacing the room as if movement might help him process what his mind was struggling to accept. "This isn't possible," he muttered under his breath. But the words felt hollow, because somewhere inside him, he knew it was. The logic was horrifyingly simple. Something happens. Something goes wrong, badly wrong, and then he resets it. The world begins again. A second chance, a correction, but not a perfect one, because each reset left something behind. Traces, fragments, memories that didn't fully disappear, not in him, and not in the children. That was why they remembered. That was why they spoke with certainty. They weren't predicting anything. They were recalling events from a timeline that had already played out, a timeline he had chosen to erase. The thought made his stomach twist. How many times had he done it? How many versions of the world had existed, only to be undone by his decision? And worse, what gave him the right? He stopped pacing. That question lingered longer than the others, because for the first time, he didn't have an answer. The memory returned again, uninvited. But this time, it felt different, clearer, sharper, more complete. He was back in the room, standing in front of the console, but now he could feel it. The weight of the moment, the gravity of the decision. This wasn't instinct, it wasn't automatic, it was a choice. He looked down at the button, ROLLBACK, and for a brief moment he hesitated. That detail struck him harder than anything else, because until now, every version he had glimpsed Every fragment showed him pressing it without question, without pause. But this time there was hesitation. Why? The memory pushed further, beyond the image, beyond the action, into something he hadn't accessed before, a feeling, doubt, not about what would happen if he pressed it, but about whether he should. The implications unraveled rapidly. Every reset erased suffering, but it also erased everything else. Every conversation, every connection, every moment that mattered, gone, replaced by a version that might be better or might not, and no one would know. No one except him. And now, the children. His breath caught as the realization fully settled. The resets weren't clean. They weren't perfect. They were breaking something. Memory, continuity, reality itself. That was why the children existed the way they did. Why they remembered what shouldn't be remembered. They were the proof, the evidence, the consequence. He stepped back in the memory, his hand still hovering above the button. And then, something changed. Not the room, not the console. He didn't press it. The memory fractured there, unable to continue. But the implication remained. That was the moment the timeline split, the moment that created this version, the one where he didn't reset, the one where the children remembered everything, the one where nothing was erased. He opened his eyes again, his chest rising and falling unevenly. The apartment felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the weight of what he now understood. This wasn't just a secret. It wasn't just something he had hidden. It was something he had forgotten on purpose or been made to forget, because knowing it, truly knowing it, changed everything. It meant that every disaster he had prevented, every moment he had fixed, came at a cost no one else could see. Entire versions of reality gone, erased, overwritten. And now, for the first time, he hadn't pressed the button, which meant this timeline, this version, was real in a way the others had never been. Permanent, uncorrected, unprotected. He looked down at his hands as if expecting them to feel different. They didn't, but he knew better now. These were the hands that had ended worlds, quietly, repeatedly, without anyone ever knowing, until now, until the children remembered, until one of them looked at him and asked the one question he could no longer avoid. Why did you reset it? The drawing. He couldn't stop looking at it, even after the child had stepped back, even after the playground had fallen into that same unnatural quiet. His eyes remained locked on the piece of paper in his hands. It should have been simple, just a child's drawing. Rough lines, uneven proportions, a world reduced to shapes that barely held together. But this wasn't simple, because every line meant something, every detail felt intentional. His fingers tightened slightly around the edges as if grounding himself in something physical might make it easier to process what he was seeing. It didn't help. The image pulled him in. At the center of the drawing was the room, not a perfect representation, but unmistakable. The walls weren't straight. The perspective was wrong. Shadows didn't fall where they should, and yet it was accurate in the only way that mattered. It felt right, cold, empty, endless. The kind of place that didn't exist in the real world, but existed anyway. At the center of that impossible space stood the console, drawn with thick, repeated strokes, as if the child had gone over it again and again, trying to get it exactly right. Not because they were unsure, but because it mattered. The surface was blank except for one thing, the button, ROLLBACK. The word was written in jagged, uneven letters, too deliberate to be accidental, too clear to be misunderstood. His breath slowed as his gaze shifted downward, to the figure standing in front of it, him. There was no face, no detail that could identify him to anyone else, but he knew. The posture, the position, the slight forward lean, as if caught between action and hesitation. It was him. It had always been him. But that wasn't what made his chest tighten. It was the hand, drawn hovering just inches above the button, not pressing it, not pulling away, just suspended, frozen in the moment of decision. That was the difference. That was what separated this drawing from the memories flooding back into his mind. Because every memory he had seen, every fragment, ended the same way. His hand pressing down, the reset, the end, and then another beginning. But not this time. This time, something had changed, and the drawing proved it. A faint chill ran through him as a new realization began to surface. This wasn't a memory. Not exactly. Memories felt fixed, defined, complete. This felt unfinished, like a snapshot of something that hadn't fully happened yet, or worse, something that could still change. He swallowed slowly, his throat dry. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more controlled, but only on the surface. The child didn't answer immediately. Instead, they watched him again with that same unnerving calm, as if the question itself didn't matter, as if the answer was obvious. "You saw it," the child said finally. "Not you drew it, not someone showed me. You saw it." The distinction mattered, because it meant the drawing didn't come from imagination. It came from observation, from memory. But whose memory? His or theirs? His grip on the paper tightened again. "That's not possible," he said, though the words lacked conviction, because everything about this already defied possibility. The child took a small step closer, close enough now that he could hear their breathing, steady, even, unaffected by the weight of the moment that was threatening to crush him. "It didn't happen like this before," the child said. Before. There it was again, that word that carried too much meaning. "How many times?" he began, but the question collapsed under its own weight. He didn't want the answer. Not really, because part of him already knew it wouldn't be a number he could accept. The child tilted their head slightly, studying him. "Usually you don't wait," they said. Usually. The pattern was becoming clearer. Not just repetition, expectation. A version of him that acted without hesitation. A version that didn't question, didn't doubt, didn't stop. "But this time," the child continued, their voice softer now, almost curious, "you did." His eyes dropped back to the drawing, to that single, impossible moment captured in imperfect lines. The hesitation, the pause, the choice, and suddenly it hit him. This wasn't just a drawing of what was. It was a record of what had changed. Something had interrupted the pattern. Something had broken the cycle, and that something was him. A wave of unease washed over him, deeper than before, because change meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant consequence. If every previous version had ended with him pressing the button, then those timelines had been controlled, corrected, contained. But this one was different. This one was still unfolding, unfixed, unresolved, real. "Why didn't I press it?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. The child didn't answer right away. For the first time, there was a pause that felt genuine, not calculated, not expected, almost as if the answer wasn't as simple as everything else had been. Finally, the child spoke. "You started to remember," they said. The words settled heavily in the space between them. Not fully understood, but impossible to ignore. His mind raced, trying to connect the pieces, the memories, the resets, the fragments left behind. The children who remembered what shouldn't exist. And now, him. Remembering too. Not everything, not clearly, but enough. Enough to hesitate, enough to stop. His gaze returned to the drawing one last time, to the version of himself frozen in that moment of decision. And for the first time, he understood what made it so terrifying. Not the button, not the idea of resetting everything, but the fact that he now had a choice he hadn't allowed himself before. To press it or not. To erase everything or let it continue. And if the drawing was right, if this truly was the version where he didn't press it, then whatever came next would be something no one had ever seen before. Not even the children. Not even him. The twist. It was never about prediction. That was the first illusion, the easiest one to believe, because prediction implies uncertainty, possibility, a future that hasn't happened yet, something flexible, something that can still change. But this was something else entirely. The children weren't guessing. They weren't imagining. They weren't even seeing forward. They were remembering. That was the truth that unraveled everything. Every accident they described, every failure, every moment that hadn't happened yet, but always did. They weren't glimpses of what would be. They were echoes of what had already been, a reality that had played out to its conclusion and then been erased. The man stood there in silence, the weight of that realization pressing down on him harder than anything he had felt before. Because if the children remembered those events, then those events had existed, fully, completely, with consequences, with outcomes, with people who had lived through them and then been undone, not prevented, not avoided, erased. His mind tried to reject it, tried to reframe it into something more acceptable. but the pieces fit too perfectly. Every coincidence had been too precise, too consistent, too exact, because they weren't coincidences at all. They were remnants, fragments that hadn't been fully wiped away, left behind after something that was never meant to be remembered. And at the center of it all was him. He closed his eyes, the image of the console returning instantly. Fragmented this time, not incomplete, clear, defined, real. The button, rollback. It wasn't just a tool, it was a boundary, a line between versions of reality. Every time he pressed it, everything after that moment ceased to exist, not paused, not stored, gone, replaced by a new sequence of events that branched from before the failure. A second chance, a correction, a rewrite. But no rewrite is perfect. Something always remains. That was the flaw. That was the truth no one had seen until now, except the children. And now, him. His eyes opened slowly. The world around him felt different. Not visually, not physically, but fundamentally. Like the surface of reality was thinner than it should be. Like everything he saw was just one version among many others that had existed and no longer did. How many, he whispered to himself. The question wasn't rhetorical anymore. It had an answer, a terrible one, because the more he thought about it, the more memories tried to surface, not clear enough to count, but enough to understand. This hadn't happened once, or twice, or a handful of times. It had happened countless times. Each reset creating a new version, each version leaving behind traces, each trace accumulating until they could no longer be ignored. That was why the children existed the way they did. They weren't anomalies. They were the result, the accumulation of everything that had been erased. Their minds weren't bound to a single timeline anymore. They carried fragments of all of them. That was why they spoke with certainty, why they never seemed surprised, why they didn't react with fear. Because to them, these events weren't new. They were repetitions, variations, outcomes they had already lived through in some form. The man felt a chill run through him, because that meant something even worse. If the children remembered multiple versions, then they also remembered him. Not just this version. All of them. Every time he had stood in front of that console, every time he had made the decision, every time he had ended a world to start another. You always fix it. The words echoed again, but now they meant something different. Not reassurance, not expectation. A pattern, a role. He wasn't just someone who had the ability to reset. He was someone who had been doing it repeatedly. Systematically, like it was his purpose, or his burden, or both. And then, the final piece fell into place, the thing that made this version different, the thing that changed everything. This time, he hadn't pressed the button. The implication hit him like a shockwave. Every previous timeline had ended the same way, with correction, with erasure, with control. But this one had been allowed to continue, unchanged, unfixed. And that meant all the consequences, all the events the children remembered, would finally be allowed to happen, fully, irreversibly. His breath became shallow, because for the first time there was no safety net, no reset, no second chance waiting at the press of a button. This was the version that would not be undone. The version where every mistake would remain, every disaster would unfold, every choice would matter, permanent. And that was why the children were watching, not just remembering, watching. Because even they didn't know what would happen next. For the first time, there was no past version to recall, no previous outcome to describe, no memory to rely on, just uncertainty, just possibility, just a future that had never existed before. The man looked down at his hands again, at the same hands that had rewritten reality more times than he could comprehend. And for the first time, they felt unfamiliar, because now they weren't holding control anymore. They were holding consequence. And somewhere across the city, the children were beginning to understand it too. The pattern was broken. The cycle was gone. The resets had stopped, which meant one thing. For the first time in countless iterations, this timeline was real. Final reveal. The city didn't change all at once. That would have been easier to understand, easier to accept. Instead, it shifted slowly, subtly, like something beneath the surface had begun to move. At first, it was small things, moments that felt slightly off, a conversation that ended too abruptly, a stranger who seemed to recognize someone they had never met, a delay in something that should have already happened, the kind of inconsistencies people normally ignore. But now, they were harder to dismiss because the children had stopped speaking, not completely, but the certainty was gone. The calm, precise statements about what would happen had disappeared, replaced by something else. Confusion, hesitation. For the first time, they didn't know, and that terrified them. Across the city, reports began to surface again, but they were different now. Not predictions, questions. A child staring at a street corner whispering, "It's supposed to happen here," but nothing did. Another refusing to leave their home, insisting, "This is where it changes," but no one knew what it was anymore. The pattern was breaking, and with it, so was their certainty. The man stood at the edge of it all, watching as the world began to behave in ways that felt unfamiliar, even to him. Because for the first time, he didn't recognize what came next. There were no fragments, no memories pushing through, no sense of repetition, just silence, the absence of something that had always been there. And that absence was louder than anything else. He returned to the place, the room, not physically, but in his mind. The console stood exactly where it always had, unchanged, unmoved, waiting. The button remained the same. Rollback, still within reach, still possible. That was the truth he couldn't escape. This wasn't permanent because the option was gone. It was permanent because he had chosen not to use it. A choice, not a limitation. His hand hovered over it again, just like in the drawing, just like in the moment that had created this version. He could still press it. He could still erase everything, undo the uncertainty, restore the pattern, bring back the versions where the children knew what would happen, where disasters could be corrected, where reality could be controlled. All it would take was one decision. But now he understood something he hadn't before. Every reset didn't just fix the future. It destroyed a reality, entire lives, entire worlds, overwritten, forgotten, except by those who weren't supposed to remember, the children. And now, him. He lowered his hand slightly, not pulling away but no longer moving forward. And in that hesitation, he realized the truth that had been building toward this moment. The children had never been the anomaly. They had never been the mystery. They were the consequence, the proof that something had been broken long before this version of reality began. And now, for the first time, nothing was being erased, which meant everything that happened from this point on would be real in a way nothing else had been before. Permanent, uncorrected, unavoidable. He opened his eyes. The city stretched out before him, unchanged on the surface, but fundamentally different beneath it. Because for the first time, the future wasn't something that had already happened. It wasn't something waiting to be remembered. It was something being created, moment by moment, choice by choice, without a reset, without a safety net, without him intervening. And somewhere in the distance, a child looked up, not with certainty, not with knowledge, but with something entirely new, something none of them had ever experienced before, something no previous version of reality had ever allowed. Uncertainty. The man took a slow breath, and for the first time, he didn't reach for the button. He simply stood there and let the future happen. Closing question. What if the future you fear has already happened? Not as a possibility, but as a memory that no longer exists. What if every mistake, every disaster, every moment that went wrong was quietly erased, rewritten, forgotten, except by a few who were never meant to remember? And what if you were the one who made that choice, again and again, pressing the button, resetting everything, convincing yourself it was the right thing to do? But now, for the first time, you don't. No reset, no second chance, no way to undo what comes next. Only one version of reality, only one path forward, and every consequence stays. So the question is no longer about what will happen. It's about you. If you had the power to erase every mistake, every tragedy, every version of the world that went wrong, would you keep fixing it? Or would you finally stop and let this one be real?
Shadows crawl where the